problem of evil is one often used by atheists as an argument either against the existence of God or against the attributes of God. Christian philosophers and theologians have put forward a number of different responses to this problem, some good, some bad. Recently, a YouTube atheist who goes by the handle Apologist put out a video wherein he claims to have struck a devastating blow to any number of different proposed theodicies. But is this the case? And that's what we're looking at today in this episode of the BLOGCAST, so hang in there while the title card rolls.
Theodicy Destroying thought experiment called Paradise Hell. Now, by Theodicy Destroying, I just mean that this thought experiment can provide an undercutting defeater for just about any kind of theodicy or even defense against the problem of evil, or at least the ones that I've heard so far in all my years of study on the subject.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. I am Triggerman 1976, and welcome back to the BLOGCAST. I'm glad you're here. 2 points very quickly before we get into today's topic and looking at this video. If you don't mind, please hit that like button, help move this video up in the algorithm so it can get out to more people. If you're not already a subscriber, please hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell so you can stay informed when new episodes of the BLOGCAST are posted. Second, you can follow me on X and Instagram at Triggerman1976, when you can find links to my social media and all of my blogs and other content in the link tree in the description as well. So, what is the problem of evil? Now, one of the first things you will encounter when you search for the topic of the problem of evil on the internet is more than likely the Wikipedia article, which defines the problem of evil as the philosophical question of how to reconcile the existence of evil and suffering with an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God. Now, the problem of evil is often divided into two distinct sections. First, the logical problem, and second, the evidential problem. Now, the earliest possible evidence for the logical problem of evil traces back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who lived about 3 centuries before Christ. Epicurus' argument was picked up and reframed by the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. And so, most often when you encounter this argument, it'll be presented as such. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Is he able but not willing? If God is able but not willing, then he is malevolent. If he is willing but not able, then he is omnipotent. Hume's argument and its various restatements by any number of village and professional atheists are targeted at the same objects, what is often referred to as the omni attributes of God: omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence. And so the argument from the logical problem of evil is essentially formulated this way: if an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God exists, then evil does not. There is evil in the world, therefore an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent God does not exist. Now, in terms of its logical form, and it of course it follows and is compelling and appears to be reasonable. But appearances do not make an argument valid, which is something that we'll come back to, because in the past few decades, as the logical problem of evil has been responded to, atheists have shifted their attack to what is known as the evidential problem of evil, whose foremost proponents are William Rowe and Paul Draper. The evidential argument is most often formulated as: If God exists, there are no instances of gratuitous evil. It is likely that there are some instances of gratuitous evil. Therefore, it is likely that God does not exist. Now, again, here we have an argument that, in its appearance and form, is both logical and somewhat compelling, but rarely do people probe beneath the surface of the argument to its substance. Namely, they forget to ask two very important questions: what is evil? How do you know it? These two questions often expose what the person making the argument from evil against the existence of God are often assuming that can only be accounted for if Christianity is true. Maybe that's a rather bold assertion on my part to make, but until atheists can proffer an answer to these questions that flows from their worldview, then they don't really seem to have much to offer. Which brings us to the counter apologist.
Probably the best tool in the atheist's arsenal is the problem of evil.
Now, he clearly believes that the problem of evil is a strong argument for atheism, given previously assumed premises of the argument. Now, I believe that could be true, but it can only be true in the same way that a hammer can be used to drive nails, but also be used to break fingers. Perhaps that point is just a little bit on the excessive side, but it necessarily brings up a question as to the moral difference between two sets of actions. Is there a moral difference between using the hammer to drive a nail and then using it to break someone's fingers? If so, what is it? That's the question that we need to answer.
The issue here is that all theodicies, or attempted explanations as to why an all good and loving God permits evil and suffering, really boils down to what is known as a value question. A value question is always going to be answered with a subjective opinion because it always comes down to something along the lines of, is X worth Y amount of cost?
Is a moral state merely about cost, or does it involve something else? Now, I only ask these questions because I believe they fundamentally expose just how weak this argument is going to be. And I say that because of this example.
Imagine we're in the middle of a particularly hot summer, and let's say my air conditioner seems to not be working as well as it should. So I call a repair company, and they come back and they say it'll cost you $2,000 to fix it immediately, or if you could wait a week, it'll only cost you $1,500. Now, at this point, I'm faced with a value question. Is it worth it to me to be comfortable in my house immediately for $500, or is the money I'd save worth more than a week's worth of my discomfort? As you can imagine, how you answer this very much depends on a number of factors. Perhaps I or someone else in the house has a medical condition, and being in high heat can lead to sickness or even death. Or maybe I'm a billionaire, and so the $500 is so insignificant that I just pay to have it fixed immediately. On the other hand, maybe I don't make so much money at all, and I don't have the spare $500. Or maybe I live alone and I don't mind the heat all that much, and so I'd rather just have the extra money.
This is where I think that the weakness of this destroyer is exposed, because the problem is not whether or not one can afford the repair, but that the problem exists in the first place. If the air conditioner had never been invented, then there would be no need for it to be repaired. In effect, the existence of the air conditioner is what created the problem, since it's what needs to be fixed. Before it existed, there was no problem. After it existed and began to malfunction, then it became a problem. Now, it's not to say that there isn't a cost necessarily involved in the repair in this analogy, but if you don't see where I'm going with this, just hang in there.
In the business, we call this foreshadowing.
Now, the counter apologist then invokes Christian philosopher Richard Swinburne, specifically his argument that's found in The Existence of God, where Swinburne writes, Suppose that one less person had been burnt by the Hiroshima atomic bomb. Then there would have been less opportunity for courage and sympathy. One less piece of information about the effects of atomic radiation, less people, relatives of the person burnt, who would have had a strong desire to campaign for nuclear disarmament and against imperialist expansion, and so on. Of course, removal of one bad state or the possibility of one bad state will not remove much good any more than the removal of one grain of sand will make much difference to the fact that you still have a heap of sand. But the removal of one grain of sand will make a bit of difference, and so will the removal of one bad state. However, the counter apologist seems to fail to mention, as quickly as he says that such a situation is insanely implausible, what he fails to mention is that the very next paragraph, Swinburne essentially characterizes this belief as profoundly naive, where he writes, what in effect the objector is asking is that God shall very greatly diminish the number of sufferers and intensity of the suffering produced by natural processes, and the harm that humans can do to each other. That our influence would be limited to those with whom we come into contact. There would be no possibility of influencing for good or ill distant generations. And most of our beliefs about how to cause effects, good or evil, would be beliefs with which we would be born. Such a world would be a toy world, a world where things matter, but not very much, where we can choose and our choices can make a small difference, but the real choices remain God's. The objector is asking that God should not be willing to be generous and trust us with his world and give us occasional opportunities to show ourselves at our heroic best. Swinburne's point that it's very easy to create scenarios about a world that God, at least in the bare theistic sense, could have made. But then he points out that this isn't the world we live in, which brings us to the supposed Theodicy Destroyer.
Consider a thought experiment where a loving God decrees that after a life much like our own here, non-believers are sent to paradise hell, where they will be in eternal loving communion with God, and there will be no suffering or evil for the rest of eternity, or at least their eternity. But then the believers will be sent to another life much like our existence here on earth. In their new life, they may have it easy or hard, determined randomly, but will be guaranteed to perform the kinds of goods that can only be accomplished if evil and suffering are permitted. If they perish in that life, then they move on to another afterlife just like it, and so on for all eternity. Now, the question to the theist is, which afterlife do you want to get sent to?
Now, just a few moments ago, I noted that he had offered what I saw as a faulty analogy that identified the wrong problem. And here is where I believe his thought experiment suffers the same error. Well, what is this error, you might ask? The error is that it's not a thought experiment. According to Scripture, according to the revelation of God, this is our reality. Humanity in Adam, in the garden, was given a choice: live in the garden with God in full participatory communion with Him, or live outside of the garden, subject to relatively uncontrolled whims of the world. Albeit this choice wasn't presented in those precise terms, but in more blunt terms: life found in obedience or death in disobedience. In Adam, whether you see this as a historical or analogical fact, humanity rejected God's offer. We think of that if given the choice, we'd always choose paradise, but in reality, we often choose its opposite. As confident as the counter apologist is that he's destroyed any possible theodicy, all that he's demonstrated is that he can't escape what Scripture has revealed, what God says he already knows. And part of that revelation is that God, in the person of his Son, came to recover what had been lost, and not merely to restore it, but to give humanity something better. For more on this particular response, I have a fuller treatment of it linked below in the description. Well, that's all for this episode of the blogcast. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure and hit that like button. If you found it interesting, please share it with your friends. And if you want to help this channel grow, please hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to follow me on X and Instagram at Sugarman1976. And until the next video, God bless.